Welcome back, everyone. I am so excited to be here today with Colby Ornell and Katie Milligan, fiction editors for Gulf Coast Magazine. And we were just talking about Texas, what things are like in Texas. Apparently, it's not as warm as I had hoped it would be for their sake. But I'm really excited to have you guys here today. As always, thank you all who came out. And if you have any questions, just type them into the chat and I will work them into the conversation. So how are you guys today?
Doing well, excited to chat here.
I'm good.
Good. So let's jump right in and tell us about the origins of the magazine. I know it started in the early 80s, and I think you guys probably weren't around for that part of it, but can you tell us a little bit of the history of the magazine?
Do you want to go ahead, Colby, or do you want me to go?
Yeah, I can go and you can add things that I'm sure I will forget.
Yeah.
So we have sort of a network of a few things. We have the UH graduate program in creative writing. We have Gulf Coast and we have Imprint. And all of those are really centered around Donald Barthelme and the people that he worked with to sort of found the program. So we have the Barthelme Prize in short fiction. And so basically the idea of it is that, the organizations and publications that we have really support, great writing and great art. We're not just sort of just writing. We publish a pretty substantial degree of art, art criticism, and things like that. Katie, do you want to add anything?
Just showing our latest issue.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, and then Imprint that Colby mentioned. So basically it's I don't know if folks are familiar. So it's kind of it's a separate organization from the University of Houston's program. It's a community organization, literary arts organization. I can speak to that more because I also work there. But it's a community literary arts organization that does classes, that does workshops, that does readings, and does a lot to support local Houston writers. And so that program and the University of Houston kind of work together, and they're separate organizations, but they work together on a lot of things. So, we have our Gulf Coast editorial meetings at the Imprint House. Funding kind of comes from both Imprint and the University of Houston for the journal as it continues. But yeah, I mean, it's a biannual journal. So we put out 2 issues a year. They're bigger issues than you might see in some other journals. So because we do poetry, we do fiction, we do nonfiction, and we do visual art, like Colby was saying. So it's a big issue. There's a lot that we are putting out there each time we're publishing something. It started with the support that Donald Barthelme gave to, I would say, the writing world of Houston in general. But as the great programs that he kind of gave rise to have continued to grow, so has, the scope of the journal itself.
Mm-hmm. So is every writer or editor who works with the journal a fan of Donald Barthelme's work? Is that sort of like a prerequisite for coming into the university and the magazine, that you've got to be familiar with his work and his whole kind of oeuvre?
I wouldn't say no. I think it's more, he's a founding force of the literary scene in Houston in general. And so it's hard to touch a literary organization in this city without something that he has supported. But it's not, I wouldn't say that, I would say that's where kind of the genesis of the magazine and these other programs came from, but they now exist as, independent, journals, programs that are functioning, with the tastes of the people who are currently involved in them, I would say.
Sure.
Do you agree, Colby?
Oh, yeah. And I think something that is really driven home when you come to UH and work with Gulf Coast and work with Imprint is that everything has been designed to support the growth and development and learning. So there's a huge, I would say, among all three of those organizations, there's a huge flexibility of style. I know there are some places that are like, we won't work with YA writers. We only want a certain type of thing. And I would say that that's not true for both the program and the journal and the sort of work that Imprint does. It's more about representing and acknowledging and developing the scope of writers. So there are people who do, more postmodern things. There are people who are very straight, literary fiction, realism. There are people who are more fantastical. But the idea is that it's quality, that it's that it's good writing, that people read and they get something out of, they enjoy it, they're inspired by it, but that can look like a lot of different things.
Sure.
Yeah. And we'll talk about this, I'm sure, a little bit more about, the kinds of things that we publish. But like, for example, we've got a story coming out in our next issue that has probably a stronger sci-fi thread than we have published, at least since, in the 3 years that I've been involved with the journal. But it, it just worked in so many levels. And so I think we'll talk more about this and the kinds of things that we're looking for. But I think, to answer your question, Becky, we're grateful always to the support and where the journal came from, but it's functioning as its own entity.
So tell us about the editorial process, because it's a student-run magazine. And what that means is that there's sort of a rotating cast of editors. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Colby and I have been, this is both our second year as fiction editors. We both served for 2 years previous, or we both served for 1 to 2 years previous that as assistant editors. So your term in any of those roles is 2 years. So I was assistant editor for 1 year and then fiction editor for now 2 years. Colby, I think you were 2 and 2. So at any time there's 3 to 4 genre editors, we call them fiction editors. And then below that, probably, I don't know what to say, 5 to 8 assistant editors. And then we've got readers below that. But everyone has everyone really does have a voice in the decisions that are made in terms of what we publish. I think we've made a lot of conscious strides in the past few years to become even more democratic than we had been in the past. So it's not that if one person who has a higher up role really likes something and no one else likes it, it's going to just get pushed through. We can talk a little bit. So basically, I'll do this quickly and then Colby, you can jump in. But basically what happens is we, with all the submissions that we receive, we as genre editors will divide them up. We get for who's going to do a first pass of reading. So we get more than the assistant editors get in terms of number of submissions, then the assistant editors get more than the readers. But everyone kind of based on how many pieces that they have been given to do a first pass reading on will bring in kind of what they thought kind of rose to the top in their pile to an editorial meeting that are intense. I mean, they can last for about 5 hours every 2 weeks. And everyone reads everyone's kind of top picks from theirs that they got, and we'll vote on the ones that were brought to the meeting. And anything that gets, maybe 1 or 2 yes votes, even if the yes votes are one of us, we're not going to push that through. It would be very rare for us to do that. It really is a function of the larger group's broader conversations and discussions of the work, and we take it really seriously. So yeah, so it's kind of fiction editors, assistant editors, readers, and we just have that just to manage the number of submissions that we get. But once work kind of bubbles up to that meeting level, there's a lot of eyes on it.
Can you tell us a little bit about what happens in those 5-hour meetings? So are you are you presenting the work and saying, this is why I really like, and then other people are saying, oh, but it's a little too much like this piece that was in our last issue, and like, yeah, what are the conversations like?
Yeah, so everyone gets the pieces cold. There's no sort of preparatory notes. And if something comes to the meeting, bios are excluded. So you don't know a ton about who the writer is unless you're the person who saw it the first time. And then, you know, everybody does sort of, presents theirs, talks about why they brought it in, what stood out about it, if there's anything that they sort of would suggest possibly in the editorial process. You know, so sometimes somebody's like, you know, I really love this. I think it's working on so many, you know, different levels, but I think the actual ending is like 3 sentences earlier. And I want to suggest that, you know, and then we sort of open the floor for people to talk about it. And, you know, it doesn't immediately become a like, here are the things that aren't working about this or that we don't like. We really talk about what we see this doing well. And I think that's like a really fantastic kind of educational opportunity to be like, all right, like, why do we think that this is special or interesting? What stands out about this? What can we appreciate about this? And then, you know, sort of turn the conversation to what maybe do we think isn't working as well? If we were to accept this and edit it, what kind of edits would we need to do? What kind of, you know, place would it fill? We think about things like length because we do have a page count, you know, so if we got a story that was, say, 30 to 35 pages, right, that would be something that we would have to consider. And when we, you know, talk about all of those things, I think it can range from just sort of pure issues of craft to, you know, certain things of genre, certain things of like perspective and issues that something might bring up. So the conversations are really wide reaching, and, you know, gives an opportunity for everyone to sort of voice their opinions before we sort of take a vote. And then after we have voted on all of the pieces, Katie compiles them into a spreadsheet so that we can kind of see what the percentage is for each, and then we go from there. So we don't decide on anything in a singular meeting. We have more meetings after that to sort of look at what we have, what themes do we have, you know, what links do we have, what can we actually fit in, because there's always like a whole bunch of things that we want to fit in, but there's somebody saying, you know, no, you have to publish this amount. So what can we actually publish? What can we work with? Stuff like that.
Yeah, we always have like 4 times the number of pages that we would love to publish that we are actually able to publish. If a story reaches that phase, if a story is brought into a meeting to be discussed and it doesn't end up being published, but it reached that phase, we will let the writer know that in a rejection. We will say your story made it through several rounds of our review process. Sometimes we'll give feedback, like a sentence or 2 about why it ultimately wasn't selected, but encourage them to submit again. I mean, these are meetings where like we've had to start instituting time limits on individual story discussions because people come so prepared to really talk about these stories. Like, it's not like, I don't know, yes or no. Like, people really get invested. And, you know, we have a lot of different, I think something that makes the team that we've got so strong is that people are coming with different preferences. People are coming with different styles. I would say I could kind of describe each person's style in terms of the things that they tend to like very differently. So different people are going to say, I'm going to go to bat for this story that I brought in or that someone else brought in. And then they'll articulate why they really liked it. Or like you said, Becky, sometimes it's, we really like this, but last issue we published something very similar in tone, in theme, in subject matter, and we just want to give, you know, this in the space, limited space we have and work that we can put out in the world every year, we want to give space to a broader variety of things. And sometimes that's just poor luck, you know, just that a story was great, but we just published something similar. There's nothing we can do about that, but we might tell the author that when we say, you know, this we couldn't, you know, except for this reason, please send us more work in the future, and hopefully the same thing wouldn't happen again. Something I also wanted to say, Becky, you asked about like do the editorial teams rotate in and out? I think something that's good is that it's there's never a point, or it's very, very rare, at least from what I've seen, for there to be a complete overhaul in like for everyone to be replaced year over year. So there's 4 of us who are fiction editors, Colby and myself, and then 2 other editors. Colby and I have both been there. This will be our 2nd and final year. And then there are 2 other editors who this is their 1st year doing it, and they will continue on next year. So it's not as if every year or every 2 years, there's a whole new slate. And I think that can be good because it allows for fresh air to come into the editorial process, but it keeps some consistency going to where if you have received positive feedback from editors in fairly recent history, there's a good chance that someone who liked the previous work that you sent in will still be involved in the journal in some capacity, unless it's 10 years down the line. It's not like quick rotating, people are graduating in and out, always changing. There is more of a stability to it than that, just based on how the terms are set up.
Okay. And how do you guys decide if a piece is right specifically for Gulf Coast? So does that come up in the editorial meetings where you're saying, I love this poem, I love this story, I love this essay, but it's not quite on par with what we're trying to put out into the world? Do you think about sort of like the brand of Gulf Coast, or like the ethos of Gulf Coast? And do you ever have a situation where you love a piece, but it doesn't quite line up with the vision for the magazine?
I mean, I'm curious to hear what you think, Colby. For me, I would say, honestly, I don't think that we've ever come at it in that way. I don't think there is a certain, I mean, I can say that like and Colby will probably be nodding to this because she'll be like, yep, that is what Katie likes. I feel like my preference as an individual editor is for kind of like deep psychological nuance in a story. I am sometimes the advocate in the room for a story that is quieter, but I think in terms of like a plot level, but I think is doing a lot underneath the surface emotionally. Others are going to be advocating more for plot-based work or more experimental work. So everyone's got something different going on. But I don't think that and so, sometimes it's my vein, sometimes it's other people's veins. I'm not saying that that's what we're looking for all the time, but I'm just saying that I don't think that the pushback has ever been, this is really well written and we like it, but it doesn't fit with our brand. I think we publish a really wide variety of work to where I don't even know that we could say that and have it really mean something. I mean, as long, like I said, we're publishing something coming up in the next issue that is, it's literary work. It has a strong sci-fi thread running through it as well. And have we published something like that? Not in the past, at least 3 or 4 years. Do we think it's working very well in a space that we don't normally play in? Yes. And are we publishing it? Yes. So Colby, what do you think? I don't think that we come at things in that way. We have standards, obviously, it has to be really strong work because we get so much, but there can be a lot of ways that something is so strong.
Yeah, I think that we definitely, we look at quality of writing for sure. I think that all of us are like, the writing has to be good. But I would say the most unifying theme is, a unique story in some way. So I think when I'm often reading, I'm looking for something that I haven't seen before, or I haven't seen that way, or I feel very confident that I could not write that story. Those are the ones that stand out to me, where I feel like the writer is really doing their thing. There's, a specific perspective they're writing from. There's a specific style they're writing in, but I can feel the sort of ownership and command of that, and that decision to, I'm going to tell this story and I'm going to tell it this way that I want to tell. And I think those are the pieces that to me, rise to the top. And that sometimes means, it's in a totally strange, different, unexpected way. And I'm like, this is bewildering, but like, this is your own thing. or it's something that's very lyrical and, what you would think of as traditional literary fiction. And that also sort of means sometimes, like, I think that we have tried really hard to be, sort of swallow this idea of like, what I think is great is the thing that is great. So there are sort of always things that I'm like, is this my favorite thing? Personally, if I were to like put it on a poster board, my favorite short story of all time, no, but I can recognize that this is a great story and it's great for these reasons. And it's not just about, what floats my very particular boat or what floats somebody else's, but a group of people all sort of recognizing, hey, this is doing something really special, really distinct, really, interesting, and we're excited about it.
Sure.
And I think that's why the big group that we have, it's not just like one person in charge of making decisions. So like, I'm not going to, say specific story names, but I can think of a story just with me and Colby here. I can think of a story 2 issues ago, I think it was, that I know Colby brought in that other people loved. So I'm in the minority here and it wasn't my favorite story. We published that story. It's not, I don't have the ability as one editor to put my foot down and say, I don't like this. And then that's it. The reverse happened this past time, where there was a story that a lot of us loved. And I know Colby didn't like it. And like, that's fine. A story is not going to get published if no one likes it. But I think it's not, there in a journal, I'm sure other people here are involved in other journals in various capacities. There's always a bit of a luck of the draw of whose kind of pile you end up in first. There's no way, with the vast volume of submissions we get, there's no way to completely account for that. We usually have people kind of reading, checking through decisions that are made on that first pass to some extent. But once it reaches a higher level, it's not up to one person. And we have a wide variety of tastes that kind of have a voice.
And how do you think about, I see Margaret, if you have a question, just feel free to go ahead, type it into the chat and I'll.
Oh yeah, okay, I came in a little late, so I wasn't sure to take.
No worries.
So, I don't know
okay,
if
go
this
ahead.
is answerable, but I was wondering, because I've had over the years, and I haven't been submitting in the most recent years, but for a while I did a lot and published 10 or 11 stories. I recently counted, I've had 50 really serious notes that got to that level of, this is good, we took this pretty seriously. So if you have, 100 stories, because I write stories, that are really pretty good, but they're not going to rise to the very top level. I'm just wondering if you would be able to say anything about what would distinguish the really pretty good story from, can you think of anything you might say about what makes the really best story?
So something I think that we have, especially in the past 1 or 2 years, I think a theme of our editorial discussions have been around beginnings and endings of stories. So I cannot tell you the number of times in a editorial meeting where someone will bring in a story and either the person who brought it in or the rest of us who were discussing the work will say, I so want to say yes to this. And I loved so much of it, but it falls apart at the end. And they didn't 100% pull off what they had set up for themselves to pull off. This is not the ending for this story. And sometimes it's a matter of like, it needs to end a few paragraphs or pages earlier. And sometimes it's that the real ending of the story isn't there yet at all. And sometimes we'll be like, I am so disappointed that I can't say yes to this story. We have seen strong endings of stories be the hardest things to pull off. And the really successful stories are the one who really follow through to completion on the premise that they have set up. And beginnings the same way that, you really want to like it, but it took you too long to get into it. Of course, there's other things we could say. And a lot of it gets story specific, and that sometimes a few things will be working well, but it's just so particular to the story, like, something at a character level or something at a thematic level, not kind of lining up. Like, it's hard to say generally, but if I had to say like the number one reason that we are forced to reject work that is otherwise really strong comes down to that, at least in what we've been seeing.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think that about almost every novel I read. And I'm not trying to be, coy, but it's true. And a lot of movies say where you think, why did they not cut that off 10 or 15 minutes before? So that actually is a really good answer. I have to say I've taken classes with Becky in person, so I just want to, that's a disclaimer, I guess. But
no, it's hard.
thank you. That's actually that's a really interesting.
Endings are the hardest thing to pull up. I'm working on a novel. I write stories and I'm working on a novel right now too. And the ending that I have right now is not working. So I need to figure something. It's hard, right? I don't know, Colby, would you say the same thing?
Yeah, I would say that, or I would say that there's some sort of level that we want something else or more, or some sort of access to something that we can't figure out in edits. So maybe it's we want more of a sense of character, or we think that one of the plot threads is distracting from the other plot threads and we can't figure out a way to fix that in editing or change that in editing without sort of taking the story and changing what it is. So I think often one of the big decision makers is what kind of an edit would this need and what kind can we do? Because what often happens is we have a very short deadline to edit things. And sometimes it's like, we would love to work with this, but here we have all of these pieces. We know we have this much time. And this would be a substantial edit and it would maybe change the story completely. And, we don't know if we feel right about doing that. But I think often it's, we know that this isn't the ending. We don't know what the ending is. But we know that this isn't it. And we want something else. And those are hard to sort of pitch to people too. We've tried to do that and it doesn't always work because sometimes the writer doesn't know and they have to try to figure that out and they're like, I really don't know. And that's always a hard thing to sort of work with, where you're saying, change the story in a dramatic, content level way. Yeah.
I would add to that we are not a journal. I know, just like as a writer and receiving, I'll receive like, you almost made it kind of rejection sometimes, and it'll say, we had a problem with these few lines, and I'm sitting there being like, well, I would have changed those 2 lines. Like, why didn't you ask me? So I don't think that we don't approach things that way. I think if we really love a story and we don't think that the changes are structural, they're more at a line level and not too deep, we're willing to take on some work with a writer and say, we're gonna, do we think this is 100% perfect? No, but we think it's almost there and we're willing to put in the work to get it as close together as we think we can get it. So it's not like if there's 1 or 2 lines that people have a problem with, that we're just going to be like, we have better work. That's just not, if we see a story that we really believe in, we're willing to put the work in. But to Colby's point, it becomes harder if the changes involve, like, to change this, then you have to change this whole other thing, and we just don't have the time to do that. That's a different story. But we will put in a lot of editing work in the cases where we're able to do it.
Yeah, we always edit.
Yeah, thank you both. That's really interesting.
Do you, when you guys are curating the issue, do you think about how the pieces work together? So if you have a quieter, more lyrical piece that maybe is the one that Katie defended and said, this is the deeply psychologically nuanced piece that I love, will you then try to have a bolder and louder piece to complement it? Or do you try not to think about that and just go for the best work across the board?
No, we absolutely do that. But we look at a lot of different factors to make sure that what we have is a well-rounded issue. So we look at, what are the themes that all of these are dealing in. Like, for example, do we get down to it and we've got 8 pieces that we could publish, we only have room for 5, and 5 of them are about romantic love, for example. Not that we don't write that's a human condition for the people write about for a reason, but we don't want to publish 5 stories that are all about that. We want to talk about other relationships as well. We had, and themes will come up in weird ways. Like sometimes you have an issue where for some reason half of the things you loved are about the same theme and you have to pick one. Like we had a lot about mothers and young children, and we probably had 3 or 4 that we could have published in that, but we don't do theme issues, so we couldn't do that. So we'll sit down and we'll say, okay, here are the 10 that we could publish. We have room for half of these. Which one of these along these dimensions that we look at would make a very well-rounded whole? And sometimes that does mean that for reasons of overlapping theme or subject matter or voice or structure, we just have to make a decision between some of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that what it is always a little bit surprising. So like this past semester, we had a ton of like we stories, more than we'd ever seen before. And we kept remarking on it, like, why are we getting so many we stories? And then we're like, we're the ones bringing these in.
Like
this
the
is
plural
us.
first person.
Yeah.
But inevitably, you start to look at, okay, well, what different perspectives do we have? How are stories being told? And then having a conversation about like, okay, why is this story being told this way? And where is that the most impactful? And so, I mean, we get pretty down into all of the different aspects of the story. What is the topic? What is the theme? Who's telling it? Because I think just, we don't want stories to be all told the exact same way. We want, different themes, different ways of telling it, different genre. And I think a lot of that sort of happens organically, that people bring in different things and we're very open to that. And I think that one of the great things about the team that we have is that people are willing to say, okay, personally, this isn't the type of story that I gravitate towards the most, but I think it's really good. And so there's a lot of setting aside the personal preferences and the ego in favor of, you know what, maybe I don't love, we stories, but hey, I really like, this about this. And then other times, like they're funnier. And, last year we got a lot of stories that had penises in them. And we were like, we
as a
can't
character.
publish. Like, yeah, from the perspective of like a penis, or like had a penis in it, just there was a lot of them. There were a lot of vagina stories. And we were like, we cannot publish this many genital stories. We're going to get a reputation. People are going to be like,
be the theme of the issue.
Yeah. We did think that would be a great, like the genital issue
Not
would
the
be
brand
great.
you want to be going for.
We don't really have a brand, but we know we don't want it to be that.
No, without, yeah.
We'll take a dirty story or a story that, I mean, we published some things that really push the boundaries in really compelling, interesting ways, but not for just like shock value. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So we had to think about that. We were like, all right, how many genital stories can you really publish in an issue? How many things can sex be really, a forefront of it? How many things can be, about a mother before it becomes overwhelming and you start to wonder, what are the differences between these stories? Why are they all about penises? Yeah.
Are you guys seeing a lot of pandemic stories now, or not so much?
I thought we would get more, honestly. It was at first we got a few like right at the beginning, and it was kind of like, well, obviously you wrote this in the past month because the pandemic's only been happening for a month, so like see you. I thought we would, maybe it just hasn't come through my pile, but I haven't seen as many as I thought. And there have actually been, we're publishing one in this next issue that came through my pile. That was, I think, I would say that this applies to a lot of subject matters, not just the pandemic, but the pandemic stories that have risen to the top for us. And there's only been a few. have been ones that take place in the world that we now have come to recognize as a pandemic world, but aren't 100% about that. And so they are people living their lives in this altered reality that we now are in. And so therefore it does comment on that altered reality, because how can you not? Showing people living in that world comments on that world, but it's not titled like My Day in a Pandemic. Like it's like it's the world is the setting, and then the characters are doing something real and recognizable. And I think that almost says something stronger if you want to talk about the pandemic than say like, I'm going to write a story and the moral of the story is something directly related to the pandemic. I just think sometimes they've been too on the nose, and that hasn't been an enjoyable read. But there's one that we're publishing that that is, and it takes a more indirect approach, I would say.
So we have a question here from Matt. Do you have a stance on historical fiction?
I mean, nothing against it. I mean, I think if it's working really well, it stands a very strong chance. I mean, we had a story that we that came really close to publishing 2 issues ago, and sometimes I think back on it as like the one that got away, that I'm like, we should have we ended up going back. We decided not to, because we had those it had kind of thematic overlap in another way with something else in the issue, but then we went back to the writer and said, is it still available for the next issue? And it wasn't, but they've sent in more work, and it was historical fiction to the extent that it was happening, I think it was the early 1900s, and it was dealing with like a certain industrial class of people, and there was a woman. It was a woman who she was gay in the early 1900s, but she was married to a man. It was a very compelling story. And we didn't end up publishing it. Some of us wish we had, but it came very close. And I think you classify the way it was working as historical fiction. And that wasn't the reason why we didn't publish it. Colby, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think that we see a ton of historical fiction, so it does stand out to me when we get it. Yeah. I don't think that we have any biases against it. I don't have any problem with historical fiction. In 2 years, you could ask the people who are editors the same question. I think the trick with historical fiction is that, there's a really delicate balance of like making sure people, readers understand where we're at in the world, what place, what time, what situation, and then also making sure that they understand or get a great enough sense of, the characters, the interpersonal dynamics. And I think that balance can be, in a story, especially because you have limited space, hard to pin down or hard to get quite right. But when, like he was talking about, when you see it happen, it's really exciting because it is distinct. I don't think that there's a ton of historical fiction stories. And I can think of some that, definitely took place sort of in the past that we were drawn to, and we were like, we need a little bit more information to fully understand this. And so that balance of sort of information and story. Yeah.
And because we don't get a lot of it, to your point, Colby, if we got a historical fiction story that was working very well, I think we would actually be more excited about it, because it's something new that we haven't. We're always excited to publish things that we haven't published recently, like if it's something fresh for us. So honestly, if a story came in that blew us away, the fact that it was historical fiction might even be a plus, because it would be something new.
I think you mentioned art. Sorry. Again, that I might have missed at the beginning. So I didn't quite hear that. And I wondered if, say, do you ever like commission art and then pick a story because it might not illustrate each other, but go well.
No, so that's separate. So we do, one thing about the journal is the genres are handled by different teams. So we are the fiction editorial team, or two members of the fiction editorial team. There is a poetry editorial team, there is a nonfiction editorial team, and then I believe, Colby, is it that? So then, and then above all that, we have our, our managing editor, our editor-in-chief, our digital editor, who kind of sit on top. It's more of their full-time job. And they, I believe, are the ones who solicit and curate the art, the visual art that appears within a issue. Sometimes there is like a dedicated portion of an issue that is curated by a specific artist or on a specific theme, but it's never like a themed issue overall. So I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if sometimes there are very happy coincidences where the art that is featured happens to line up with poetry or fiction that is published in that journal as well, but it's not something we just don't, we as the fiction team don't have a role in that selection.
Okay, thanks.
And we have another question here from Tamara. Do you have a special interest in essays or poems that are set in Texas?
That's a good question. I don't know really what the poetry team looks for, but I think it's pretty similar to ours, and that it's wide ranging. I don't know. I think sometimes there's a strong interest in representing communities that we sort of, by nature of the fact that we are Gulf Coast and we are out of Texas, we're out of Houston, we do want to represent those perspectives. But I don't know if I can speak to how those writers curate. I am always interested in if we get a story that is set in Texas. But I think that we always are sort of looking for a lot of things.
I think it's the same kind of thing to what I would say to the historical fiction section though, Colby. Like, I think if it came in and it was set in some, a place in Texas that we recognized it was doing it really well, like, would we get maybe more excited about that because we're like, oh, like, I'll give another example. There was a story. So I haven't always lived in Texas. I grew up in Maine. And there was a story that we got that we TBD if it will be published in an upcoming issue, but that took place on an island off of Maine that the reason I particularly liked the story is because I knew the island that it was modeled, or the type of island that it was modeled after. And so therefore I knew that this was a very accurate representation of that place. Mm-hmm. And I could say, like, this writer, so I think if something came in that was set in Texas and we knew that maybe we could recognize even more so than an editor who doesn't live in Texas, the real validity and truth of something that's being represented just because we have experienced it and lived in it, would that make us like it more? Maybe. But say we have two stories and one is pretty good, not perfect, not great, not that anything is ever perfect that anyone writes ever, but including myself and all these books that I'm looking at right now. Say we have two stories and one of them is set in Texas and we like it a lot, and then there's another one that's not set in Texas that we love. We're never going to take the Texas one because it's in Texas.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question here. From Mary Ray, can you talk about the nonfiction needs of the journal?
So we can't, unfortunately. It's a separate team. So, I mean, I just wouldn't want to represent them without them being here. Not to say that we are not lovers and readers and sometimes writers of nonfiction ourselves, but within the structure of the journal, the genre is a separate editorial team. Mm-hmm. So probably wouldn't want to speak to it without them here.
But there is a need for the magazine. It is.
Oh yeah, we publish a lot of nonfiction in every issue. It's not as big as the fiction team, but there is a dedicated nonfiction editorial team for the journal. So yes, absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about, so I wonder this with student-run lit mags, and sort of a bias in terms of the youth, like the voice of younger writers. And I hear this concern a lot from older writers, that they feel like they maybe don't have a place in the lit mag world. And I was just wondering if you try to publish a variety of voices across the age spectrum, if that's something you think about as kind of MFA students, PhD students.
I can't even say how excited I am when we feel like, so I have some pre-MFA, some of my closest writing friends that I met through writing classes that I took before my program are people who are in their 70s. One of them wrote one of my letters of recommendation for grad school as a peer, and just as a peer, someone who had taken a lot of workshops with me to speak to that aspect of my candidacy. And I'm so excited whenever her work gets published. We stay in really close touch. I love her work. I think her life experience brings something to it that I certainly couldn't write, not being in my 70s. We publish a lot of the writers that I know that I personally have, I see their work come into the journal several times, and we haven't taken it yet, but we really liked some of it. We've encouraged them to continue submitting. I can think of 2 or 3 of those who, just based on their bios, I know that they are decades older than me. If anything, it's a plus, is what I would say. But Colby, what do you think?
Yeah, I also think our team represents, depending on the year, a pretty, sometimes wide range of ages. We have people who are, in their early 20s, people who are in their 30s, people who are in their 40s. We've had people older than that. So we are not exclusively youths. Which is, I think that that's one of the sort of most surprising things sometimes, that you walk into a grad program and you're like, okay, wow, these are all people who were at all different points in their lives. Some of these people are, single. Some of these people have children. Some of these people have many children. Some of these people have children that are grown. And, the different stages are totally present. And I can say for sure that we've, made a conscious effort to not just publish writers that have a ton of publications, but are emerging writers. And I wouldn't say that, just thinking about our issue that we just worked on, I wouldn't say that any of them fits fully into like one age category. I think we have some pretty young people, some definitely more established people in between.
Yeah, because sometimes people are emerging because they're younger, but sometimes people are emerging, quote unquote, because they are older and they had another career. I mean, I had another career for 10 years before I went back to grad school. There are plenty of people who have other careers for 40 years before they return to their writing. And so they're emerging, as funny as that is. And yeah, we love to publish new voices.
How do you feel, and could only be of you too, about the likability of characters? There was a sort of faded as a topic, but there was a time when everyone was saying, your character, your main character, your protagonist has to be likable on some level. And I wonder what you think about that.
I have a soft spot in my heart for the unlikable narrator or character. I think we sometimes we will get stories that are offensive in certain ways that we can tell they're based on how it's written. There is not a large intended distance between the characters being written about and the perspective of the author writing them. And when we can see that there's not an intended distance, and that this character, when a character is unlikable for a reason and to show something that the story is trying to show, I will go to bat for a story like that. When it's just an unlikable character because of the perspective that it's coming from, obviously that's a different story. But I think I love complex characters, and a character that is believable and complex is going to be unlikable at certain times. So I wouldn't say that that's something we shy away from at all.
Yeah, I can think of one of the stories that we published in a past issue that I don't think the protagonist was at all likable, but we found them very complex and the situation very interesting, and we were really excited about that. I think that it's always a challenge to sort of navigate this question of what is the writer intending, and are they, we don't know them, right? We know what their bio says, but beyond that, we don't know them. What is somebody who is opening this journal up and they can't see anything about the person writing this? What is that person going to think? And what sort of ideas might that suggest that this person believes in, or that we're promoting? And so if something sort of toes the line where we're like, this is going to offend in a way that isn't, controlled, or, goes to a point that we're like, this feels like we're promoting an idea that we really don't believe in, or that we don't want to promote, then we take a step back. But unlikable overall, I don't think that we think that they have to be likable. I think there are several stories that we've looked at recently that are very, very unlikable protagonists, very unlikable. We were like, this is great. It's a complicated, interesting situation with people maybe not behaving well.
And I always ask, is the unlikability on purpose? Like, is the author wielding the unlikability of this character knowingly to achieve a specific end about what it's suggesting about the world it has created? And that's when I think it works really well. And I personally have a problem with people who don't want to read stories about unlikable characters. I know people like that, and I think that that's just too rosy a way of looking at the world, and not a way that I'm interested. I mean, I think writing is exploring the human condition, and to do that, you need to be willing to look at the unlikability of the people that you're writing about. But if it seems like it was on accident, then that's a problem.
Yeah, or just overwhelmingly hateful, because the world is like bad enough already that if you read a story and you just like feel overwhelmed by hatefulness, you're like, okay, maybe we haven't quite got the balance of unlikable and enjoyable yet.
I see what they mean, and I appreciate the answer. I mean, there are, I think, a couple of well-known people, literary people now, who are like, to me, they're just that's too hateful.
And there's personal, like Colby and I are the two people who, whenever animals are killed, Colby and I are just like, oh man, like I just can't. Isn't there another way to get this across? Colby and I are little softies on that front, when other people will be like, oh, I love it. So it's just preference sometimes.
Yeah, every time there's like a dead dog in a story, I'm like, what is this? Why are we doing this? And people are like, calm down, it's just a story. And I'm like, no, it's not. But I mean, everybody has their personal preference. Someday that there will be a dead dog story that I'm like, you know what? This is the one that I can stand behind. It hasn't happened yet, but everybody has something.
Give us your best dead dog stories.
Yeah, we do. I mean, I think that that's something that's important. We try to be very intentional and open, and just it's okay to say in a meeting, like, listen, I have a personal preference, or like, there's a type of story that I'm not a huge fan of, as long as you're also making an intentional effort to like consider the story fairly. I can set aside the fact that I don't love dead dog stories. If there's something, like I read William Maxwell's So Long, See You Tomorrow. A dog dies in it, and I was like, God damn you, you did this really well, you know. So when somebody does that just as well, I'll be like, there we go, check the box. But trying to be fair is something that we work really hard to do, to not walk into a meeting and say, you know, I think that this writer has just the most incredible bio, so, you know, it doesn't even matter how good the story is, we should publish it. You know, that's not how we want to approach anything. So, you know, recognizing that we have biases, we have preferences, we can be open about them, and that we can also be intentional about saying, let's consider this fairly. Let's give everybody who has submitted and who has put the vulnerability and the work into submitting, you know, equal attention and consideration, because people deserve that. And, you know.
And I know we're running up against time, but I wanted one thing on that Colby just brought up that I think is really important to note is that, yes, of course, you know, we get submissions from people with amazing biographies, and sometimes the work that they submit is like, well, that makes sense because this is amazing. And so of course we're interested in publishing it. A lot of times we will get something from a name we recognize and we're so excited to read it, and then it disappoints for some reason that we are surprised by, and so we don't publish it. It probably won't even come to one of the meetings. So we are not just looking for like a big name. And I think over the past few issues, we have made an effort. We have taken very few from like pieces that we've solicited. The vast majority of the stories that we have published in the past 2, 3, 4 issues have been from what we receive in slush. And it really, we have even pushed back in certain cases about people saying, you know, we want to publish this because it's this name, and we're saying we don't think the work, you know, this particular story stands up to their reputation, and so we're not interested in promoting it over these other stories by lesser known writers that we think are doing so much more than this individual story. So I feel really strongly about that, and I want to make sure that message gets across.
And you guys are both also submitting writers as well. Does being an editor give you a different perspective on the submissions process?
I think it does, mainly for like selfish reasons, and that I take things less personally, I think, and is what I mean by that. Like I think I love editing work. I hope to continue doing it for a very long time. I like seeing the other side of things. It's just helped me in my own writing, I think, a lot. And so I think before, you know, in the many years that I've now been submitting, I think there was a time when I would have gotten a rejection and it would have ruined my whole week. And now I think I just have I'll still obviously get disappointed, like if a journal has been holding on to something for a while and I get my hopes up and then it doesn't come through, or if I get like, you almost made this rejection, or the opposite, if I've gotten a personalized rejection from a place before, and so I think this is the one, and then I just get a form rejection on my next one. Like there's all these ways to be disappointed, but I think seeing just, you know, there are just levels of it that just are chance that even the best run journal can't control for. You know, when you're getting multiple thousands of submissions a year, you have to have a process, and you don't have people who are just one, like the journals that have just one person who are reading their work and it's their full-time job. Yes, maybe you can say that, you know, there's going to be whose queue you're going in because it's just the one person, but then that limits what the journal is going to publish to that one person's preference. So I think just understanding that there are these parts of it that are chance, but there are these, but also knowing like how excited we get to publish something makes me like I love accepting pieces. Like I always like, that's the best day of the whole semester is the day we get to accept pieces. So I think it has made me more realistic about rejection, but also appreciating the process in other ways too.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. You know, it really comes down to so many things, and often it's space, and you know, to realize that doesn't make the story any less great, in my opinion, when I have to say no to it because we can't fit it and that's, and that's the reality, or that there's a similar theme. And I think that it's easy to get discouraged, but if you're getting some positive feedback, that's intentional. We don't just, we give things out, when we say, hey, this made it really far, not because we want people to like feel good, but because that really happened, and we want to encourage people. And there's always stuff that, we see that gets withdrawn, and we're really disappointed about that. Or, we're like, I'm really glad, like, we probably wouldn't have been able to take that. I'm so glad that got published somewhere else. So it makes me feel encouraged to put more things out there to more places. Just knowing that a lot of the times it's a numbers game. That really comes down to it sometimes.
We had this really cool thing happen where so there's another journal, I don't know who's familiar with the journal Carve, but they do a decline accept feature, where if something that they liked and then but ultimately didn't publish gets accepted by another journal, they will do a feature on that. A piece they did not publish that someone else published, they'll do a feature on that. So we had a story that we published 2 issues ago, Colby. I know you were the editor on Fallout, which is a great story that came close at Carve and didn't get it, and we published it. And then a few months later, a piece that came close for us, but we ultimately didn't publish, won Carve's annual contest. So it just goes to show that I think, like Colby said, like, if we can't publish something but we really like it, I get so excited to see it published somewhere else. Like, I was so excited to see that story get picked up by Carve. So yeah.
Are you guys still maintaining a blog?
That's not our role. I'm trying to
Sorry, that was sort of a random question, but I was just thinking of it because you were talking about Carve will do this feature where they write about something. It just made me think about the kind of posts that Lit Mags put on their blogs. And I remember following the Gulf Coast blog for a while, and then I didn't see new updates. So I wasn't sure if that was something that was being actively maintained anymore.
So Gulf Coast does have online work that is published that is separate. So there are online editors who, separate from a blog, but like actual fiction and poetry and nonfiction that are published online. So that's a different separate team from us. We work on the print journal, but there is someone who works on fiction for the online piece. And there will be times where we will forward work over to them to say, this was submitted to the print journal. We can't accept it for these reasons. You might be interested in it. There's also a digital editor who does like blog work, social media work. I don't know what he has been working on blog wise. Now I want to ask him and find out.
We've all been a little bit separated. There's so many people that work for Gulf Coast. You haven't really been able to get all of them in one place since the pandemic happened. So usually we have these like huge meetup type things. And just for safety reasons, we've had to move things to much smaller groups or much more virtual. And so I think it makes us grateful that we have our team, but it also, creates this distance that you're like, oh, hi guys over there. How's everything going? And it's just, it's sort of one of the unfortunate, pandemic effects that you don't know as much about. But I'm grateful that we've been able to like keep everything running through all of this. We've still been able to, pay staff, pay all of the writers. It's a huge priority. And that, we have a team of people that were willing to sit on a Zoom call for like 5 hours, to discuss stories. Not everybody would do that. And so
on a Saturday morning.
Yeah. So we have a great team of people who work really, really hard. And that's a real advantage.
So a lot of journals have not been able to put out issues, or at least not to their normal cadence, because just so many pieces of the publishing world are involved in the same challenges that the whole world is. So we've been really proud that our publication calendar has remained consistent.
So what's on the horizon for you guys? Are you open for submissions now? Do you have a contest coming up, new issue coming out?
We have a new issue coming out. We are open for submissions now. Yeah, if you submit anything, definitely put in your, cover letter, hey, I joined this thing. We would love to see work come in from people. So yeah, we are open for submissions for another few months.
Great.
Yeah, and then,
And
we
then we will have,
the contest.
yeah, coming up once normally, or at least last year, we had it where our, like right around AWP last 2 years ago. So right around like March-ish, our regular submissions will normally close, but our contest submissions will remain open for a little bit longer after that. And then we close in the summer months and then open back up.
Okay. And the contest is named after Donald Barthelme, of course.
He's everywhere.
Yeah. That's great. And so people can find the magazine at gulfcoast.org. Is that right? Gulfcoastmag.org?
Of course, Mag, yeah.
Go gulfcoastmag.org. And you guys are on Twitter at Gulf Coast.
I think it's Gulf _
Mhm.
Coast.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much. This was hugely informative and helpful and interesting and fun.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for
Yeah.
joining.
Thanks for having us.
Can't wait to read your work.